for me to be here. My name is Babu Butovan, and I'm a research scholar following my doctoral studies at National University of Advanced Legal Studies, Kochi. And the paper that I am presenting today is titled Article 51AH, The Untrodden Path Towards Social Emancipation. Before we go into this particular discussion, I have actually divided this discussion into two parts. Being an ardent follower of the Constitution of India, being a believer, being a student of the Constitution of India, I intend to constitutionally analyze this particular provision and also highlight the recent activity that has been taken up in Supreme Court regarding interpretation or enforcement of this particular constitutional provision. So before we begin the discussion on national scenario, next slide, please. I'd like to introduce you to you all will be familiar with this particular international document known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that came into effect in 1948, post-colonization and the post-World War II. Click once more. Under the UDHR of 1948, we can see under Article 29(1), it states everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of personality is possible. The concept of duties has been clearly enshrined under this particular document, even before the Constitution of India came into effect in 1950. That is why I wanted to draw your attention to this particular document. Next slide, please. Now, if you look at the constitutional edifice of our Constitution of India, 1950, there are certain philosophical foundations upon which this Constitution is built upon. Slide once more, please. Click once again. Yes, this has been mentioned by Asaria earlier. Yeah. Time and again, yesterday and as well as today, regarding what is intended by the concept of the preamble to the Constitution. But in addition, I'd also like to mention Part 3 of the Constitution that deals with fundamental rights, Part 4 of the Constitution that deals with directive principles of state policy, and Part 4A of the Constitution that was inserted in 1976 via the 42nd Constitutional Amendment that incorporate the aspects of fundamental duties. Now, when we discuss this particular aspect, we have to understand that there is a particular line of thought that is kept in line throughout the constitutional provisions. That is, whatever that comes after these provisions, be it the Part 1 or Part 2, or the provisions under Part 6, which deals with the aspects of what are the components of the government, how is state legislature formed, how is parliament formed. We can see that this particular ideal is kept intact. For instance, if you look at the preamble, it speaks, we the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic, and the aspects of equality, justice, everything has been enumerated, and it runs parallel in all the constitutional provisions. Next slide, please. And that brings us to Article 51AH of the Constitution. That states that it shall be the duty of every citizen of India to develop scientific temper, humanism, spirit of inquiry, and reform. So these components, these constitutional provisions, why this must be highlighted is that I already mentioned about Part 3.
One more minute.
I'd like to have 2 more minutes for it. The reason I mentioned this particular provision is because Part 3 that prescribes fundamental rights are enforceable through a court of law. That is, if our right is violated, there is a provision under the Constitution, especially under Article 32 and Article 226, that provides for an enforcement of this particular right. Whereas when it comes to those provisions under Article 36 to 33 to 36 to 51, which speaks about directive principles of state policy, and our fundamental duties under Article 51A, there is no enforcement mechanism. Because duty, legally, when we interpret duty, it is identified as what we say, an act or an obligation. It may not be always enforced. So even after having the presence of scientific temper, humanism, and social reform, all these particular spirit of inquiry, even after having the presence of these terminologies and philosophies within the structure of the Constitution, we can see that none of these are enforceable because it comes under the aspect of a duty. Rights can be enforced. Duties are not enforced. It is an innate thing that comes from the ideology of an individual. If you have a duty to do something, nobody can force it. It comes from within. That this concept of humanism and all, we should identify as such. I don't want to go into the aspects of scientific temper, humanism, and the definitions of it, because it has already been done in previous sessions. But I'd like to highlight a couple of more instances. Just some next slide, please. I know I'm running short of time. Next slide. Yes. Once more. Once more. Next. Okay, these are some of the judgments of the Supreme Court in which the fundamental duties aspect has been discussed. Next slide, please. This is the final aspect that I would like to introduce. That is J.S. Verma Committee that came into effect in 2000. The Supreme Court actually in 1998 initiated a particular committee to discuss teaching of fundamental duties in schools. So
2 minutes over.
Just one minute. The reason why I mentioned this particular aspect, if you look at the recent activity, for instance, I have mentioned cases by Ashwini Kumar Bhattacharya and Durga Dutt, where enforcement of fundamental rights were called in before the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court has presently hasn't given any approval for the enforcement of fundamental duties. So that's why even after having this concept of humanism and everything within the Constitution, we cannot exactly claim it in the form of a right or make laws on the particular aspects. So this is an area that requires further deliberation. And on a concluding note, I'd like to quote Rabindranath Tagore, because at the end of the day, what we are looking at is not just the aspect of social emancipation, but also what we call survival of humanity itself. Here I like to quote Tagore. This is some of his verses. Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where the knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where the words come up from the depth of truth, where the tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father,